We're so concerned about other things, heart disease, and we take care of so many other issues we prevent, but nobody really thinks about their bones until they're older and they either get a diagnosis of osteoporosis or osteopenia, or they fall and have a fracture and break a bone. And the problem is it's really common. In the United States, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 will have a fracture due to osteoporosis in their lifetime. So that's huge. In other countries, it's better worldwide. It's 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, but still, that's a huge number. So it's very prevalent. And the problem is the consequences of these fractures are devastating. So if someone has a hip fracture, 24%, actually it's even over that now, will die within a year after that hip fracture due to complications.
In this podcast, I am speaking with Margie Bissinger, who is a physical therapist, integrative health coach, author, and happiness trainer. And we are talking all about bone health, how to improve your bone health. She has over 25 years of experience helping people with osteoporosis and osteopenia improve their bone health through an integrative, comprehensive approach. And she's the creator of the Happy Bones, Happy Life online program, as well as the host of the podcast by the same name. She's a wonderful expert in this area, a wealth of knowledge, and this is an interesting conversation, given that she also has expertise around happiness, which is something we also talk about in this conversation, and an area I'm always interested in, because I think what could be more important to study for us all than happiness. Happiness and health are at the top of my list, certainly. So enjoy this conversation with the wonderful, brilliant bone expert, Margie Bissinger. Okay, welcome to the show, Margie.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So we are going to be talking all about bones. You are an expert in bone health. Now, this is not the sexiest of health topics. This is not one of the things that people really wake up in the morning and get out of bed thinking, man, I really need to make sure I have healthy bones. But it's one of those things that once you don't have healthy bones and you've got osteopenia or osteoporosis, all of a sudden it becomes a big concern. So why don't you tell people why they should be concerned with having healthy bones before they get a diagnosis of having poor bone density?
It's such a good question because we're so concerned about other things, heart disease, and we take care of so many other issues we prevent, but nobody really thinks about their bones until they're older and they either get a diagnosis of osteoporosis or osteopenia, or they fall and have a fracture and break a bone. And the problem is it's really common. In the United States, 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men over the age of 50 will have a fracture due to osteoporosis in their lifetime. So that's huge. In other countries, it's better worldwide. It's 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, but still, that's a huge number. So it's very prevalent. And the problem is the consequences of these fractures are devastating. So if someone has a hip fracture, 24%, actually it's even over that now, will die within a year after that hip fracture due to complications. And then a huge percent will also either they're just never going to be independent, or completely really changes the quality of your life. So the good news is that there's so much that can be done to prevent this. So nobody has to be one of these statistics. And it starts in childhood. I mean, it really starts. We have our peak bone by age 18 in women, or the most bone we're going to get, 85 to 90% of our bone by age 18 in women and 20 in men. So this starts way back, but all through life, there are things we can do. And the things you do for your bones help the rest of your life as well. So it's not something separate.
Are there statistics on the rates of osteoporosis and osteopenia, from, let's say, 50 or 70 years ago compared to what they are now? And if so, what do those statistics look like?
That's an interesting question. They really don't have those because they didn't start all the evaluations that they do now. And they didn't have, here's the thing, they didn't have the medications, so people weren't really paying that much attention when they didn't have drugs to treat it. And unfortunately, in conventional medicine, it's sort of sad because you will get a diagnosis of osteoporosis and they'll say vitamin D. They do work on vitamin D, calcium, and they'll say exercise. They're not specific. But typically, if you have a certain number, and all that number means on the bone density, they look at your bone density compared to a 30-year-old and how many standard deviations away. So it's just really a number. It only talks about density, not quality. But anyway, they'll put you on, a medication without looking at root causes, without seeing what's really going on. So there's so many other things that can be done. That's the exciting part.
Okay, so I think what I was trying to get at with that question, and it's a shame we don't have good statistics, but I'm trying to understand the prevalence of this condition over the last few decades. Is there any good data that we have that can speak to that? Is this a condition that's been relatively constant throughout, the human species? Like, do we have evidence that this exists in hunter-gatherer peoples from the remains of archaeological digs or from studying modern hunter-gatherers? Or is this something that is uniquely in modernized, westernized humans?
No, that's such a good question. And certainly when they look at cultures that are more hunter-gatherers or, different societies, they are at lower risk, or people who are active throughout life, and the hunter-gatherers would be that way. And that's very interesting in terms of, have they actually looked at their skeleton in detail and say that it's gotten worse? Or, I mean, it is more of an epidemic now, but people are also living a lot longer. So they're really seeing, older age. And so I do think it existed, it did exist, but when people were more active, when people, the diet was so different back, there wasn't all the processed foods. And I think the level of activity, as well as the nutrition, and people didn't have all the gut issues and all the root causes of osteoporosis. So they haven't really done those the longitudinal, those studies like that. But certainly in those cultures, there was less osteoporosis, and they have found that, those activities increase bone density, and there is a difference.
Okay, so what are some of the key root causes, or maybe not some, but maybe take me through a good comprehensive list of the root causes of osteopenia and osteoporosis?
So it can start from childhood, and that's an interesting point, because when someone gets a number, is it that they're actively losing bone? Because inflammation is a root cause. So when there's anything that's causing inflammation in the body, whether it's dysbiosis with the gut, whether it's, autoimmune issues, it can also affect the bones, just like can affect different body parts. The bones can be affected. So any type of inflammatory process can be a root cause of osteoporosis. And so, however, it's important when people get diagnosed, are you actively losing bone, or were you a child that didn't exercise? You didn't have a good diet, or you had eating disorders, so it can be that you just never developed that much bone growing up. And so it's not that you're actively losing, it's just you don't have as much. So it will matter what it is. But in terms of, so anything with inflammation, anything with the gut, people who have issues, whether they're, any type of thing going on, Crohn's, or, any of those issues, irritable bowel, all of those things where there's an inflammation, they may not be absorbing their nutrients, and the bones need nutrients. So if they're not getting the micronutrients, you could be losing, you're just not having the material for strong, healthy bones. So any type of gut issue like that. And they've even found gut bacteria. There's a correlation between bone density and the diversity of the microbiome. So they're finding such a relationship with the gut and the bone connection. So that's a big issue in terms of, again, so you either didn't build bone because you weren't active, you didn't have a good diet, or you had inflammation, or different medications. Steroids significantly reduce bone, and a lot of people, whether they're on inhalers or whether
you're talking about corticosteroids.
Yeah, corticosteroids,
as opposed to like what most people think of when they hear the word steroids, which is more like bodybuilding, anabolic, androgenic steroids.
Yeah, corticosteroids. A lot of people are on that, whether they're inhalers or for different conditions, so that throughout life will certainly reduce bone density, as well as one of the biggest ones is the proton pump inhibitors. And
Mm.
so, and so many people have acid reflux and heartburn, and people are on this for a long period of time. And it's a huge risk factor because it reduces stomach acid. And we need that stomach acid to break down the proteins and the nutrients for the bone. So there's a big correlation with people who've been on proton pump inhibitors, any of those, the Nexium, the Prilosec, any of those that are reducing stomach acid and osteoporosis, as well as even, people aren't told, even if they are on medication such as antidepressants, which is so prevalent today, that can also, affect bone density and bone quality. And so,
Mhm.
medications, anti-seizure medication, thyroid, too much thyroid hormone, hyperthyroidism, that can cause, problems with osteoporosis. But so there's the gut inflammation. Then there's also inflammation if you have a sensitivity, let's say, to gluten. So celiac disease is known as a big risk factor for osteoporosis, but just gluten sensitivity or wheat sensitivity also. And I see this all the time where people go off gluten, and not only does their bone density improve, but then their arthritis improves and so many of the other conditions.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to think what else I missed. And also hormones. For women, a lot of times they'll lose bone. I mean, that's common after menopause. That's where it accelerates bone loss. And so a lot of times, if people are working with bioidenticals or different things, that can reduce, or prevent some of the bone loss, or just stress. Stress is the body's own cortisol. It increases your body's own inflammation. And so the cortisol has been shown to reduce the activity of the bone building cells. So how we react to stress is a very big issue. And I see this, all the time. So it's all the factors, it's multifactorial. You need to really look at everything. And just being a couch potato, the bones respond to the forces placed upon it. So people who are inactive, that puts them at much higher risk for osteoporosis.
You said in passing there, you gave the example of someone who didn't build a lot of bone density growing up as a child. Can you explain that more in depth? What would be the reasons for why they wouldn't build enough bone density?
Okay, so there's a couple. So activity is a big thing, and it scares me with our kids today who
Mhm.
are, who many of them are just more sedentary, or they're working on the computer and they're just not getting out, because the way that bones builds and gets strong is through forces placed upon them. And what that is, in terms of jumping, forces through the bones against gravity. So being on the jungle gym, jumping and doing all those activities that we did, that kids do, and just playing is giving forces that say, hey, we need bone here. Because they've done studies showing, when people are on bed rest or they're not exercising, they lose bone. On bed rest, you can lose almost 1% of your bone per week. But for kids, there's a huge difference in activity levels. And they've shown, tennis players, their one arm has much higher bone density. Gymnasts have much higher bone density than other people. So we need that. We need those forces as we're growing, really, to develop normal bone. And that's what we want. So it's the one thing, the exercise and the activity. And unfortunately, there are kids who just don't do that. And then the second thing is the diet. You need the nutrients. We need calcium. We need magnesium. We need all from the rainbow. We need those bone building nutrients, as well as protein, good quality protein. And what blocks the absorption of many of those nutrients is sugar and the junk food. And so I think, depending on the diet, if you're not getting the nutrients, that's going to be, you're just not having the building blocks for good, healthy bones as you get older.
If you were going to say that there's one dominant factor in explaining the epidemic of bone density issues, what would you say is the single most important factor? Would it be nutrition, or would it be what you were just talking about, these forces acting on the bones?
I have to say it's both. I really can't say it's one versus the other, because you can improve bone density through doing both. I mean, exercise, I see this all, as a physical therapist, I've been working with this for over 25 years. And there are people that don't change anything. I mean, I'd like them to change everything and just increase their exercise, and they can improve their bone density. So I think, and you can certainly lose bone density if you're not exercising. So I have to say it's a combination. I think both can really be can be very negative, and both can have effects. And the key thing is you have to get to the underlying cause. But if you have inflammation from some process going on, let's just say gluten or celiac, you have to deal with that, because you can still be losing bone. And then, I mean, there's even other issues like parathyroid tumors that can happen. So you have to. So, but one thing I would say, I'm sorry, I can't say one if there was just one to do, and the same thing even with stress. So I just like to do the combination of everything, because you really need that for a good comprehensive program. You really need the mind, body, spirit, and the exercise, nutrition, as well as reducing stress.
Mm-hmm. So you're a certified happiness trainer. In addition to being a bone health expert and a physical therapist. How would you explain the tie-in between our mental states and our happiness and bone health? Is there a significant tie-in? Is there evidence that speaks to this? Is there maybe evidence around depression increasing the propensity for osteopenia and or osteoporosis? And if so, do you think it's mediated more by the mind-body connection, in the sense of like being unhappy leads to increased cortisol, which is, as you said earlier, decreasing these bone fibroblasts and bone production? Or is it mediated maybe more by the fact that depressed people are less likely to be physically active? Or what other dimensions of maybe the happiness bone connection have you explored?
So what I've seen is that, well, first of all, in the research, there is a connection between people who are satisfied with their life and happy or have increased bone density. So they've made a correlation with that. In terms of the research, in terms of stress, they have shown that there's actually been studies showing that, increased cortisol has reduced bone density. And also even social stress has reduced bone density. So there have been studies in humans as well as animals showing this correlation with the cortisol and reducing the activity of the osteoblast. So there is the research. What I've seen, my experience is, I've started, this is back almost over 35 years ago as a physical therapist. I had gone through sort of a bad situation. And my patients, I was working with chronic pain, and they were telling me, you're so happy. And I thought, gosh, if they only knew what I'd gone through, they wouldn't say that. But it hit me how happiness was sort of an inside job, and it wasn't based on your external circumstances. So I just started teaching. Said, what the heck? They're so unhappy. They were just like the most miserable people. What helped me. And I just couldn't get over how chronic pain got better faster. It was just amazing how back pain, neck pain, TMJ, things got better so much quicker than traditional physical therapy. So it's sort of been part of what I've done for, as I said, over 35 years, it's been part of everything. But I think it's a combination. I think, yes, there's the scientific with the cortisol, and that, when you're happier, you have different hormones going on in your body as well, and the reduced stress. But I also do think, sure, when you're feeling happier, you're much more likely to be involved in an exercise program. You're much more likely to be eating, be aware of what you're eating and eating food that's better for your body, as well as just, doing all the things that are going to help build bone. So I think it's a combination of both. But I have seen, just again, from being teaching this for so many years, that this piece of it, to me, it's foundational. It's not in lieu of, but once you get this piece down while you're doing other things, it just, who doesn't want to be happier? It's, a lot of times people think it's selfish to be happy. Just to work on your own happiness. It's just the opposite, because it's a ripple effect. When you're happy, your family's happier, and then they bring it out to the world. And, the world right now can use as much happiness as we possibly can have. But there is a correlation, and, it's fun for people to work on as well, because everything gets better. And, I always say osteoporosis is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at your life and see what's missing. You get this diagnosis, you might feel fine, and all of a sudden you're panic stricken. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to enjoy my grandchildren or go hiking or do anything. And because I'm going to fall and break it's just scary. But instead, if you look at it, okay, let me look at my body. What's going on? It's a message. What's causing my bones to break down? And you figure out what's going on, and you take those steps. People get stronger when they're when they get very strong, and that's very empowering. And they look back, and it really can be a blessing in disguise.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I almost can't help myself because it's so unusual to talk to somebody who has, formal training in the topic of happiness. I would love if we could maybe take a brief detour and explore that.
Sure.
This is kind of a weird thing, in my opinion, because it's like, what could be more important for humans to study than happiness? And yet we rarely study happiness. And the field of happiness studies has only recently, in the context of human history, has only recently even become a thing where it's possible now to get degrees, take college courses and get degrees in that field, in positive psychology and in specifically in happiness studies now. So, there's a weird sort of thing going on there. We'll for decades, we've put people into calculus courses, but have never given them a course on how to be happy. Like this seems very backwards to me. It seems like we've got our priorities very mixed up if we're forcing everybody to take advanced math courses using very bizarre calculations that, unless they have a few very specific careers, they will never see those equations again the rest of their life, and neglecting to study something that is the core of having a good life. Human health, human happiness are, I think, in my opinion, two of certainly the top 3 or 5 most important fields that we could possibly study. So, having said that, you have this formal background in that, in happiness studies. What have been some of your biggest insights? So I'm curious, maybe on a big picture level, what your paradigm of human happiness looks like.
Oh, okay. So when my paradigm of human happiness is that you wake up, you're excited about the day, you're looking forward to the day, and you fill your day with things that make you feel expanded, make you feel joyful. And life isn't easy. So when everybody has their ups and downs, and when you have your downs, you can ride the waves. You have that resilience. And the thing about happiness, a lot of people are turned off because they think what happiness isn't. A lot of people think is, oh, you're walking around in this like fake smile across your face all day. That's not it at all. What it is a deep sense of peace and well-being, regardless of your circumstances. And I like to put another piece to it also. It's to live your life in color, because so often people just sort of, how are you doing? I'm getting by. But we're not meant to get by. We're meant to thrive. And so, but the interesting thing is they've actually done research on what's called the happiness set point. And everybody has this happiness set point. It's sort of like the thermostat, everybody's at a certain level, and not everybody's the same. But what they found is that, and what makes that up, and this was studied. So it's interesting is most people think it's circumstances. That only makes 10%. 50% is genetic, but as you and I both know now with epigenetics, we can affect the expression of our genes. So we can even affect that. But 40% are your habits. So you have the ability to really increase your happiness set point. And that's what's so exciting. And there's just so many components to it. It's not, it's again, there's really when I teach 7 different areas of the set point, being like the foundation, your thoughts. So many of us have negative thoughts. What can you do about that? Are you living from the heart? A lot of people, in terms of forgiveness and gratitude, who do you surround yourself with? Are you living with purpose? Do you plug into spirit for, connect to something greater than you are? So there's many different relationships. There's many different pieces to the puzzle, but it's so exciting because there's so much that can be done. And this is where I've seen real miracles throughout my life. And again, as you said, right, we focus on so many things, but what's really important in our life, you want to enjoy. You want to have joy in your life. There's no reason to just get by. And so I agree with you. I think more people are becoming aware and realizing there is more, that why not, or that they can. I think people don't realize that they can actually improve this, and that they really, there are the concrete steps you can take so that and part of it's improving your health. If you're not exercising and eating sugar all day, that will affect your happiness as well.
Got it. Okay, so that was excellent. Very, very insightful. I love your brief, very high level summary of human happiness there. Thank you for indulging me. Let's loop back into bone health now. Let's talk about nutrients. So nutrition and maybe some specific foods and specific nutrients that are uniquely beneficial for bone health, or you could also maybe speak to the opposite direction, uniquely harmful to bone health.
Okay. So the main thing really uniquely harmful, one of the things uniquely harmful is sugar. Sugar just reduces the absorption of magnesium, of calcium, and, it's just an anti-nutrient. So definitely, so you want to get rid of sugar. And for so many people, and I see it because I have people get tested, I see so many people with issues with inflammatory foods, but gluten. For some reason, I just see that when people have an issue with gluten, a lot of times it affects the inflammation, and they're not absorbing the nutrients, and they tend to have osteoporosis or osteopenia. So I see that as a very inflammatory food for many people. In terms of what's been very interesting in the research, and I don't think people know about this, something so important is protein, is getting enough protein. Because years ago they felt, these high protein diets or too much protein is going to cause calcium to be leached from the bone. But it's just the opposite. The research now shows we need enough protein, and we need more than the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, what they say. And so, they've done research on this, and the people that have increased in the studies bone density have had more, they have higher levels. And one formula, there's a couple you can use, but you can just take your body weight, divide by 0.5. That was one that they used in some of the research studies. So, but it's more than the RDA. And a lot of times people aren't getting the protein, especially as they get older. So just very important to make sure you get good quality. I'm big into organic, grass-fed, and wild. And, if it's a protein powder, have it organic. And, whether it's vegetarian or whether it's not, but the key is the quality and getting enough protein. That's found to be very, very important. Besides that, the one that everybody worries about, and the big thing everybody is so concerned about, is calcium. Problem I've found is that people are getting too much calcium because, their whole life they're like, drink milk, do this, do that. Plus then the doctor says, oh, okay, take a calcium supplement. Well, more is not better. And so in the United States, they recommend anyone over 50 gets 1,200 milligrams. In other countries, it's less. But, and so what happens is people are getting some in their diet. They're taking more, let's say they take 1,200 milligrams as a supplement. They're getting too much. And there have been some research, not conclusive, but showing that this extra calcium isn't good. It goes places we don't want, as the arteries or kidney stones. And so we don't want too much.
Is that truly a function of too high of calcium intake, or is it more a function of calcium intake in an imbalanced way relative to some of the fat soluble vitamins, vitamin D and K and A, and other minerals like magnesium and zinc and things like that? If you're just taking calcium supplements in a way that's not in harmony with those other nutrients, like would be common in the context of getting calcium from your diet, but if you're taking it in a supplementary way as isolated calcium, is that the main issue, or do you really feel like it's just too much calcium overall?
No, I completely agree with you, but that's never been studied. That's my exact feeling, exactly what you said. That's such a very good point, because most doctors will tell people take calcium, and they do check your vitamin D level. Most of the doctors will look at vitamin D, and depending on what it is, have you, increase your vitamin D. However, what they don't put in is that vitamin K2, and vitamin K2 takes that calcium and makes sure it goes into the bones and sweeps it out of the soft tissue. So I think that's something that's really missing. Now, you can get K2 in some food. There's a Japanese food called natto, and people that, in those parts of Japan where they had natto, they have significantly reduced incidence of osteoporosis and fractures. But most people, it's pretty slimy. It's not that tasty. Most people can't get enough from their food. So it's a supplement that I recommend pretty much for almost everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, you have to, and the magnesium, it's very important. That you have the whole orchestra so that you can absorb the calcium, but still you don't want high doses of calcium. There's no reason to people. And again, we don't know because they don't, the research, there were just studies that had showed some cardiac issues and other things when people were taking too many calcium supplements, like high dose calcium supplements.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, it's not 100% conclusive. But even the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation says get it from your food, and only take a supplement if you're not getting enough in your food. So it's always food first with calcium, but we need those other nutrients. You need the entire symphony of nutrients. But the K2 is one that's missing, and I think it's absolutely critical.
And so what does K2 do? I think for people unfamiliar with this topic, it will be extremely important to understand the role of K2, vitamin K more broadly, but K2 especially. And also in light of the fact that many people, particularly in this COVID era, are using high dose vitamin D. So what is the role of vitamin D in terms of bone health, and what is the role of vitamin K in bone health?
Okay, well, vitamin D helps with the absorption of calcium, just to make it simple. And it's a complex situation with vitamin D and your parathyroid, but basically it increases calcium absorption. So we need the vitamin D. The vitamin K2 there's two proteins. There's osteocalcin. It activates osteocalcin. And what that does, the osteocalcin makes sure the calcium goes into the bone. So that's part one. Part two is it activates something called GLA matrix. And what that does, that protein, that takes the calcium, sweeps it out of the soft tissue, places it shouldn't be, so that it's not. And so together, it's doing just what we don't want to have. It's preventing calcium. It's making sure the calcium gets where it needs to go, as well as getting it out of the soft tissue. And there's two types. There's a MK4 and an MK7. And there is some controversy, like what's better. And I have the summit happening, and the doctors give different. A lot of people talk about this K2 because it's so very important. But there's research on the MK4 showing significant reduction in fractures. And that's very important to focus on, instead of like, what's your bone density? Is this reducing fractures? Because that's what we're so worried about. And so the study of the MK4, which is the problem, MK4 is a much shorter half-life. So it doesn't last very long in your body. So it's a little harder to take on a regular basis. The studies showed 45 milligrams taken, so it has such a short half-life for you to be in your system. You need to take it like 15 milligrams, like 3 times a day, ideally, versus the MK7 has a much longer half-life, a few days. So it's much easier to take. But the MK4 has shown the fracture reduction. The MK7 has shown reduction in bone density. And it's not that it hasn't shown fracture reduction. They just haven't done the same studies or used it for the same. So both are good. My feeling is that, a lot of the doctors, people recommend both. You can do both as well. And so, but they're both good. The point is you need the K2. Now, a lot of people confuse it with K1. K1 you'll get in your leafy greens. And most people, if they're eating a good diet, will get enough K1. But K1 is also involved in blood clotting. So oftentimes if someone's on Coumadin or if they're on some type of blood thinner, you really need to talk to your doctor before you increase K1. And so K1, they haven't really found, it's not the same as K2, but it's still good. And some studies early on showed, people who had more lettuce, or in different studies who had more K1 didn't have more bone density, but they had more, they had more flexibility. So if they fell, they didn't fracture. So it's all important, but the K2 is that one that I think is so critical. And so many of the experts on the summit make a very big deal that that's a huge part of their program in terms of people who have been dealing on an integrative approach with osteoporosis. Dr. Millman, Dr. Newsat, they both feel that, and they both have been using MK4. Now, Dr. Millman is saying she's open more to K2 because they're, MK7 as well, because they're doing more research. So anyway, yeah, long answer for it, but I think it's so important and something that for some reason, conventional doctors, I don't know why, because there is research on it, will just tell people D, calcium, and they'll say exercise, but they're not specific in what type of exercise. And
yeah, that's a very big problem to just say take vitamin D and calcium and do exercise without getting specific. So we're going to get there in a second. I want to touch on nutrients a little bit longer. So let me ask you this. Are there any nutrients of great importance beyond vitamin D and K and calcium?
Well, magnesium, I think is very important. Magnesium also helps get into the bones. And in terms of the bone matrix, we talked about protein, but so the calcium is embedded in this bone matrix. But what makes that bone matrix, what's important is the protein, but vitamin C as well. So I think vitamin C is an important nutrient. I also think collagen can be helpful for people, because whether they get it from bone broth or take collagen, but there's boron, there's zinc, there's biotin, there's like a whole folate's important. So I think if you're eating a good diet, I personally have people get a micronutrient panel, because I think it's so, when people want to do everything they can do, I'm a big believer in test, don't guess. So I want to see what's lacking, what's lacking in their diet. What are they not having? So really, all of those things can affect boron, all of those things can affect the bones. But again, the same in terms of the research, the ones that have been shown are the K2, really, in the calcium and the vitamin D. Even the magnesium hasn't been shown exactly to correlate, but we know it's important. We know it has so many functions. So yeah, so in terms of, that's what I like to do. I like to have people get a micronutrient test, and so we can see what's missing in terms of their diet, because a lot of times things are.
Are there any foods that you would consider bone health superfoods?
Yeah. So I like the greens. The leafy greens to me are superfoods. And so, for example, collards, collards have like 265 milligrams of calcium. They also have magnesium. They're packed with many nutrients. So you're getting a lot when you're having the collards. And a lot of people, that's not part of their diet, collard greens. But you can use it as a wrap, just steam it and put it around like a turkey burger or a bean burger, or you can saute it as well. But it's a great wrap in terms of, putting all sorts of things in it. So I love the leafy greens. I like collards. Bok choy is also one that's high in calcium. I think that has like around 150 milligrams. That's another good one. Kale is also very good. It's high in calcium as well. They have so many other components with the magnesium, and there's just many things when you take the leafy greens. What is interesting though is that with oxalates, like spinach, some people think spinach is a great food for the bones. Well, it's not, because it's high in oxalates, and oxalic acid combines with calcium to make it an indigestible compound. So you're not going to get the calcium from that. It becomes indigestible. And there's even animal studies now that are showing that with the oxalates, it even binds to additional things to reduce the calcium. So you have to be careful not to have a diet very high in oxalates. And sometimes people, can't have dairy, which a lot of people, for a lot of people, as you know, it's very inflammatory. And so they, have very high doses of almond milk and different things. And, that could be high oxalate as well. So you have to just be careful.
And some of the alternative milks have carrageenan in them as well.
Yes,
Very inflammatory for the gut as well.
exactly. And so some other food, though, I love sardines, sardines, and I always like to get the wild kinds from a good source. But sardines are great because they're high in calcium as well as protein. Wild caught salmon is good as well. So there's lots of things that are good in terms of nutrients, are high in calcium, and they're also beneficial for other reasons as well. Yeah. So I'd say those are some of my top favorites.
Great. You touched on dairy briefly a couple times so far. What exactly are your thoughts on dairy, particularly given the sort of obvious relevance to this topic, given how much dairy and milk consumption has been advertised for strong bones over many decades, and obviously we have that, and then on the other side we have people in the vegan camp who are saying, actually, they'll cite studies saying dairy consumption actually led to weaker bones, and that all these studies over here that showed positive outcomes were funded by the dairy industry and, are therefore bad science. What, sort of seeing through these different kinds of either financial agendas or dietary dogma sort of driven takes on things, what is your perception of the scientific evidence on that topic?
Well, the interesting thing, with dairy, I grew up in the milk in the milk mustache, where every athlete was, showing the milk mustache. And you're right, like you must have your milk for strong bones. Well, they found in countries, there's data that countries that have the most dairy consumption have the greatest incidence of osteoporosis. So that certainly is not, it's not a panacea, and it's not something that is.
There could be a very obvious confounding variable there, which is that, what those countries are, I would guess, would be the United States, and probably some other modernized, westernized countries that have consumed a lot of dairy milk. And those countries tend to also be the ones that are more sedentary and eating a highly processed food diet and, deficient in some of the nutrients that we're talking about. And so I would see that as a confounding variable. Are there any interventional studies where they've maybe put people in high or low dairy consumption, maybe even women who already have osteoporosis, who are 60 plus years old, and you consume lots of dairy, you consume very little, let's compare 5 years from now? Any studies like that?
Not great studies, nothing conclusive to that extent. And so, there have been times where they said there were some positive effects from dairy, in terms of in the past, and cheese and things like that, and yogurt seem to have better results. So my take on the whole thing is certain people, and I see this a lot, dairy is inflammatory. And again, you can get tested also and see, but people know. So if you're having full-fledged inflammation, many people have issues with the casein. Many people have issues with the lactose, they're intolerant. So I see this a lot. So if it's causing inflammation, it's not going to be something that's going to be helpful for your bones, because the inflammation is something that affects, there's the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, and inflammation increases the activity of the osteoclast, the cells that actually break down bone. So in that sense, the dairy is something that, for that person, in terms, if it's inflammatory, which I see a lot, I see that tremendous amount, so that would not be good for that person. For some people, sure, they can tolerate some dairy, but it has to be good quality, as well as, as well as I do, that the regular dairy that's not organic has so many hormones in it, and there's so many chemicals, and it's really unfortunate. So if people are having dairy, I always want them to have dairy that is organic, that's from the pasture, and good quality. And so there's not an actual answer in terms of like great studies that showed, yes, the benefits of dairy outweigh the negative, because they are inconclusive, and we do need calcium, we know that, but we haven't found that dairy really is the answer. And I know I've talked to a lot of pediatricians, and there's pediatricians I'm doing on my summit coming up, and there's a pediatrician as well. And, you know, they see that it's so inflammatory for so many of their kids. And so, you know, in terms, they have to find other ways to get the calcium because it's so important for your bones and not the dairy. So again, most of the people can't, you know, again, some can, but I see a huge problem that for many people it causes inflammation, which we don't want.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before we run out of time, I want to make sure that we get into one of the most important topics, which is movement and physical activity, exercise. I would argue, and I suspect you would agree with me, that even if you had the most perfect diet for bone health, even if you completely eliminated your psychological stress and were the happiest person in the world, if you did not subject your bones to lots of physical stress, physical forces acting on them, creating stress, creating tension and pressure, that you would still have very weak bones. You need this physical stress present in order for your bones to have the stimulus to remain dense, to build density and to retain their density. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And that was very well said. And you can just look at the astronauts, you know, they've looked at astronauts, and that's a big part of the research that they've done at NASA. And they found that, yeah, they lose significant bone because they don't have the forces, they don't have gravity, they don't have the forces placed upon it. And as I said, with bed rest, people are losing almost 1% of their bone per week in studies. So it absolutely, you know, this exercise is a huge, huge component.
And this gets into something that is my biggest area of focus and passion right now. This is the subject matter of my next book on hormetic stress, and this is one example of it. How subjecting the body to stress not only creates positive adaptations that confer health benefits, but is actually necessary, is required for normal healthy expression. Our biology is designed to require certain stressors in adequate amounts consistently in order just to be normal. In other words, living in an environment that has a deficit of those kinds of stressors creates abnormal cell and tissue function. And this is a great example of it with physical forces acting on the bones. So let's get specific, because we were mentioning how it's a problem that doctors don't get specific on this. So you tell me specifically, what types of exercise are the best for bone density?
Yeah, because it's interesting, because doctors will say, well, walk. Well, yes, walking has been shown to reduce hip fractures, and its balance is so important to produce fractures, but it doesn't actually increase bone density. It's really not enough. So what they found that's enough is impact. And again, that depending on how you know what the level of osteoporosis is, you may change this. But for people, you know, early on, or just to prevent strong bones, you know, jumping causes more bone to be produced, because that's the force against gravity, you know. So jumping, you know, anything where we're getting impact on the bones. So now that's one. Or resistance training, strength training is amazing. So when we're contracting a muscle against resistance, it's like, hey, we need more bone here. But they found it's not the repetitions, it's the actual force, it's the weight, so they'd rather do, you know, 8 to 10 repetitions. That's somewhat hard, you know. They have this formula, and versus, you know, 50 repetitions is something easy. And you see that people are lifting, you know, 2 pounds forever. It's not going to be enough. Just like you said, you need to keep increasing the weight so that, you know, it's not easy. Your body has to work against it, and that's how it gets stronger. So strength training at least twice a week has been shown in the research to increase bone density at any age. You know, they did a study called the Liftmore study, where they had people who had osteoporosis. This was supervised. I wouldn't suggest people look at those exercises and do it themselves, but they did show, you know, all ages increasing bone density, people that even had fractures in the past and osteoporosis. So the point is, yes, you can, but so resistance training, you have strength training at least twice a week. And then weight bearing, you know, whether it's dancing, jogging, you know, whether you're getting the jumping, you know, even in people, if they jumped, they had studies showing just jumping a few times, you know, just people jumping every day, a little bit of jumping increased bone density. So it's just important, you know, for young people to play, to jump rope, to do things at all ages. And, you know, even young mothers get so busy in their life, they don't do these things and they're not getting the forces on their bones. And it's not that hard to start a strength training program at any age,
Yeah.
and impact. So even high intensity, different types of impact training is good, but the research is the strength training as well as the impact and the weight bearing. So those are the two types of exercises that are most important. And what I see typically is that people aren't doing enough weight. They'll do, they just they don't keep increasing the weight.
Women. Yeah.
Yes.
And I was a personal trainer for many, many years.
Oh, so you know this.
A
Yes.
lot of time in the gym, a lot of time training women. And it is extraordinarily common. I would say probably almost 99 out of 100 women who even, first of all, it's rare for a woman to even approach weight training and start that. It's becoming more common now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But even among the women who sort of hear a message like the one that you are giving right now and sort of say, oh, well, maybe I'll start strength training, then it's common for them to really not understand what strength training really is. And also there's a common fear among women, I don't want to get too bulky. And let me put those fears to rest, because I can assure you it's quite difficult to put on muscle mass. If it was a problem that lots of people were waking up with too much muscle mass from doing a little bit of weight training and going, oh my gosh, I have too much muscle mass, this is a real problem. I would have run into this problem a long time ago, because I've been weight training for 25 years. In the absence of steroids, it takes a lot of work to put on muscle mass. It's very difficult. It's a very slow process, and apart from the rare, extraordinarily genetically gifted person who might put it on easier than the norm. But women in general definitely do not put on muscle mass easy, and you do not get bulky by accident without busting your butt for years lifting heavy weights. So I just want to emphasize this to your point, to hopefully let women who are dealing with low bone density listening to this podcast know lifting weights is extremely important, and don't be afraid of pushing into heavier loads, challenging yourself to actually lift some weights that are relatively heavy for you. Don't injure yourself. Obviously, don't push beyond your capacity. Be slow and smart and systematic about how you begin and progress. But the idea is not to forever be lifting the 5-pound pink dumbbells, on day one. And then a year from now, if I see you in the gym after a year's worth of workouts, if you're still lifting the 5-pound pink dumbbells, you're doing something terribly wrong. You're wasting your time,
Yeah, I just want to say two things actually. So I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely, you are right on the mark with that. And it is scary. So two things. Number one, it's so empowering. Strength training, and you've seen this, that if it's amazing when you increase your strength. I have 85-year-olds helping me move things because they've been doing it. So it's such a win-win situation. But anyone that does have low bone density or osteoporosis, there is one precaution you need to take. They've done studies showing that rounding and forward bending increases the risk of fractures, because right on the front of the vertebrae, on the front of the spine, is where fractures occur. And so you don't want to do any exercises that cause rounding. Not that you can't do everything, you just do it with modifications. And so you maintain, the inward curve, and you can do Pilates, you can do yoga, you can do everything just without doing the rounding. You're bending from the hips and knees, not the waist. And it's just, there's all sorts of things. But my recommendation is, and in the United, is to see a physical therapist. If you're scared, you get the diagnosis. It's covered. It's usually, at least in the United States, it's covered by insurance. So just ask your doctor to get a physical therapy consult for someone who works with osteoporosis. And they'll just make sure, because you want to do things safely, that your posture is good, that that you're doing everything, and they'll get you started. And so you don't have the fear. And then you can do just what you said, Ari. You can do those, the strength training, and the lifting is so powerful and so effective in increasing bone density. And you'll be older and you'll just be so active, and you'll be so happy that you did this.
Yeah, wonderful. Margie, your wealth of information. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Are there any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I just want to leave you like what I said, that not to be scared, to look at it as an opportunity, because whatever affects your bones affects everything else. And I also wanted to, can I tell them about the summit
Please,
that I'm
please,
doing?
yes. Tell them
Yeah.
about the summit you have coming up.
Yeah, so I'm really excited because I'm so, as you see, I'm so passionate about this. But last year I did a summit called Natural Approaches to Osteoporosis and Bone Health. And around 60,000 people came, and so many lives were changed. And what I did, I have physical therapists showing exercises. Actually, Dr. Sherry Betts shows how to do strength training. And so I actually have them demonstrating balance, different things. And anyway, so I have therapists, I have the doctors who work with osteoporosis and all the different root causes. And there's so many different areas in terms of nutrition. I actually have people showing how to make bone healthy meals. And so it goes on, but there's just a ton of information, practical information that you can put into your life for even prevention. So I highly recommend it. And when you sign up, you immediately get 2 classes I did, one on showing balance exercises, because that's so important as we get old. Anyway, there's lots of tremendous amount of information. And every day I teach happiness habits. So you'll get a little happier by going. Also, I do a habit a day, very quick, just something you can put into your day to get started.
Beautiful.
So,
Margie, thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll put a link for people to sign up at your summit at theenergyblueprint.com/Margie. Margie. So theenergyblueprint.com/Margie. Thank you so much. I look forward to our next conversation, either on a podcast or perhaps in person at another health seminar.
oh, well, thanks so much. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next